Welcome into the Chris Collinsworth podcast, and it's been an interesting week in the NFL this week. I got a chance to see the leading scoring team in the NFL and Tom Brady shut out. So it's unbelievable. The last time, 2 times actually, that we've done New Orleans at Tampa, I want to say they scored 0 points this time, and I think it was just 3 points the last time those 2 teams got together. If there's ever been a team that has somebody's number, it is the New Orleans Saints. It's Dennis Allen. And what they did in Tampa was just unbelievable. So we'll talk about that a little bit on the back end of this thing. But I want to welcome in my special guest, one of my favorite guys, Eric Eager, who is the head of research and development and innovation, something like that. Eric, am I even remotely close on what your job description is?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's interesting. The stat that I found is the Bucs have won the Super Bowl twice. And in both seasons, they were swept in the regular season by the Saints. So, maybe that's a little bit of an omen for Tampa Bay here this year, having been swept again by New Orleans. Maybe they'll be the first team to repeat since Brady took the Pats to back-to-back in 2003 and 2004.
But it's amazing the ramifications that came out of that game. And it all sort of happened at the same time. You know, Arizona gets stunned by the Lions and everybody's like, what? What was that? And then Baltimore, Green Bay going at it. And it looked like it was going to be kind of a casual Green Bay win. Here come the Ravens back with a backup quarterback, Lamar Jackson with the ankle. And they go in and score, and I think it's the second straight week, right? Wasn't it Pittsburgh the week before that they go for 2 and don't make it? And when you now look at post that game, when Tampa lost, the Green Bay Packers now are in a fantastic position as far as, the tiebreakers. They've got an extra game. But now it flip-flops back to the Dallas Cowboys and Green Bay Packers for tiebreakers, and the Cowboys have the better divisional record. I mean, this thing goes on and on and on, right? It's almost like, oh, forget it, I'm not going to pay attention. But I do think that one of the more interesting things that happened during the course of this week was that it was kind of a bad week for analytics. And here we are. I'm pointing the finger right at you. I'm blaming you. I think that PFF has changed the universe. You made the Baltimore Ravens go for it twice for their 2-point conversions. They lose 2 games because of it. They could have had the division locked up. They could have been the number 1 seed. Think about if those 2-point conversions are both made. We're talking about the Baltimore Ravens now as being the it team going into these playoffs.
Yeah, they're the 1 seed in the AFC, right? They would be 10-4 right now. They beat Kansas City in your week 2 game on Sunday Night Football, so they would be the 1 seed. It's interesting, right? Like, because when you look at the way in which the league has evolved, we are getting so many more. We're getting so many more opportunities to scrutinize these decisions, right? Because I'm doing this article right now where I'm looking at basically first 3 quarters of a game, 4th and 4 or less, sort of places where math would tell you to go for it, but teams maybe don't go for it. It took until 2016 for any team in the NFL to go for those situations more than half the time, Chris. And that was 3 teams in 2016. The Eagles, the Saints, the Giants. The Eagles, by the way, the next year were one of 4 teams to go for it more than 50% of the time, and they won the Super Bowl. They won it you're the last time you broadcast the game with 2 high-profile 4th down decisions. And this season, 18 teams are doing it more than 50% of the time. So, it's interesting. The analytic, I call it sort of evidence-based footballing. Evidence-based footballing is winning, right? Teams are going for it more. And as such, you're going to get the other side of variance, right? You're going to get a team like the Chargers who have 5 4th down attempts. They make 2 of them, but the 3 that they miss, of course, they leave points on the table and they end up losing a game in overtime to Kansas City. You have, Baltimore, who, interestingly, Baltimore like the going for two at the end of a game isn't necessarily like the most analytical thing in the world because, of the time left and all that. Harbaugh really made those the 2-point conversions decisions based upon the football context in which he was playing. Against Pittsburgh 3 weeks ago, Marlon Humphrey had just went down with an injury. And so he was like, if I get into overtime, I just gave up 17 points in the fourth quarter. I'm my best player on defense is gone. Let's just win the game now or lose the game now. Let's get out of here. And I think he thought the exact same thing about the Green Bay game. The funny thing about the Green Bay game is usually you want to go for the 2-point conversion after the first touchdown when you're down 14.
Correct.
The second one is sort of the one where people are a little bit like, well, you still have 40 seconds left on the clock for Green Bay and all this kind of stuff. So it was an interesting week. I do think, like I said, playing football with evidence on your side is going to work long term, but there are going to be instances, just like anybody who's played, blackjack or whatever, there are going to be instances where you make the right play and you don't get the right result. And I think it's important for folks like us to sort of educate people on, why we're continuing to sort of advocate for these decisions.
Yeah, the hard part is that so many of the really controversial decisions, and depends on what you plug into the algorithm, right? I mean, you can show anything you want with math sometimes and stats and data, but for the most part, the really hard ones are probably 51-49, 52-48 kind of decisions.
Yep.
And so occasionally you've got to step back and go, oh yeah, 52 out of 100, I win. 48 times out of 100, I lose and look like a dope. And I take all the criticism and all the newspapers and all the radio shows. Every coach who's an old school coach smugly looks and goes, yeah, that's one of those analytic dumbasses losing another game, right? I mean, you can just hear it. And the minute it happens, the minute it goes the other way, it is this roaring ocean that comes back at you because I told you so. Like they can't wait. I told you so.
Yeah. And I think, we've seen this. It's always going to need to be it's always going to need to be somebody established who does it, right? Because we saw take for example, Chip Kelly, who when he was with Philadelphia, he won he was 20-12 his first 2 years with Nick Foles, Mark Sanchez, guys like that as his quarterbacks. And, he did it differently, right? He monitored players' sleep. He monitored their diets. He ran an offense that was sort of college-y, right? And whenever somebody comes into a situation like that and they're different, the old guard wants that person to fail, right? And we're way more likely to jettison somebody who fails by themselves than fails slowly with the pack. You know what I mean? And that's, that's just, and again, when you get into that group of the 32 sort of men who get to coach NFL teams, you want to your incentives are different than you and my incentives, right? Like if I bet on a team to win, my incentives are a lot different, right? As a fan, but also as somebody with skin in the game than a coach who's trying to lose less embarrassingly, right? And that's what we saw with Chip. Like he was 10-6 2 years, he goes 6-9 in year 3, and they fire him before the season's over, right? Whereas you have other guys who I don't want to throw out names, but you have guys like Doug Marrone who have basically all their seasons are losing seasons except for one, and they get a lot more time at the plate. You had Jason Garrett, for example, got basically a decade with Dallas, basically, up and down. But again, if you sort of go with conventional wisdom, people are going to be less likely to want to root for your failure. And what's nice is that when you see a guy like Doug Peterson do different things and win, when you see a guy like John Harbaugh, who for my money is a Hall of Fame coach, do it this way, then again, to me, that helps embolden the Brandon Staleys to do it the evidence-based way, because they know that they have some cover, and it's not fair, but we're going to look back and say, well, they beat the Chiefs in week 3 because they went for 4th downs and they made a bunch of them.
That's exactly the point.
They beat Cleveland. They beat Cleveland. They beat Cleveland in large part because they went for 4th down on their own end. and they got blown out by the Ravens because they went for fourth down on their own end and they missed. You know what I'm saying? So it's again, you sort of end up with a little bit better of an average, but the swings maybe are not something we're comfortable with.
It is amazing that you rarely get credit for success when taking chances, especially in the middle of the drive. People literally forget about it in the middle of the drive. It's always the scoring opportunities. But I did want to bring up one thing that happened to Brandon Staley in that game. So, and I'm gonna freely admit here, I did not see this live. I came in later in the game, but before the half, my understanding is that they could have taken a field goal before they went in at halftime, right? They chose to go for it, got no points, momentum swing, whatever you want to say. But I know a big part of the analytical advantage of going for it down around the goal line on fourth down is, at worst, you're going to leave them down there, right? So the field position shift is still going to come back to you because you're going to assume you're going to get the ball back in good field position. Does the math change any for that situation? In other words, is there a stronger argument for taking the field goal there because you don't get the field position advantage that you would in ordinary circumstances?
Yes, absolutely. And it also so this is the thing that I think is a great discussion topic, right? Because a lot of people will say, so like there's the Mike Lombardi tweet where he said analytics can't, every situation's different, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, yes, but the models take those all into consideration. I mean, you've seen George and I, with your broadcast, it's the inputs are down, distance, time left, right? How much time is left on the clock? How many timeouts each team has. The other variable is who gets the ball to start the second half, right? Because that matters too. And so on and so forth, right? So, but the biggest thing is yes, that is taken into consideration because you're right. Like one of the benefits of missing a fourth down in the middle of a game deep is that the other team's backed up. And you sort of saw that, right? With it's a little bit different because it was because of a fumble, but one of the other miscues that the Chargers had in that game was Joshua Kelly fumbled at the goal line and the Chiefs recovered at the 1. And 2 plays later, they got an interception by Uchenna Nwosu and scored on the next play, right? You put the other team in a bad position when you back them up like that. And that's part of the calculus. Going into the half, I do agree. The reason that it was positive EV for the Chargers to go for it in that situation was because they were literally at the 1 yard line. And, if they were at the 6 or 7 yard line, the first drive of the game, I guarantee you the models would have said, hey, kick a field goal because the benefits of, your likelihood of making this conversion is way too little to justify giving up on the possibility for 3 points. So, yeah, I think in that one, the Chargers got kind of stuck because literally their offense gaining 1 yard is more than 50%. And kicking a field goal, obviously, if you think about just how many points do you expect, 50% of 7 is 3.5 points, which is more than the most you can get on a field goal. If you back that up to let's say the 3 yard line, then let's say you're 1 and 3 of making that, then 33% of 7 is less than 3, right? So then the math would say to kick the field goal because you don't get any of the second order benefits of backing a team up.
And a lot of times who the opposing quarterback is. I make the case all the time on Sunday night is that, does it really make a difference if I punt the football and I give it to Aaron Rodgers on the 20, or I go for it here at midfield and don't make it? Are those 30 yards or 40 yards, whatever, that significant because this guy is so efficient? I used to say it about Tom Brady before I watched the Saints game the other night, but now I don't do that. So it is, it's just, matter of fact, that has got to be the 6th straight time my phone has rung and I've forgotten to turn off my phone in the middle of one of these podcasts. It's a total and utter.
It just humanizes you, Chris. Remember now everybody knows that Chris Collinsworth is just a little bit like all of them.
Yeah, I'm sure there were a lot of doubts as to whether I was human. I don't know exactly which category they would put me in, but I think I've read them all on social media. It was so funny. Andy Freeland the other day, I said, Andy, I go, because you make mistakes on live television, but usually when you do, social media within 15 seconds goes wham, beats you over the head, right? And you know it immediately. And so I said, just pay attention for me, who's the guy who's in the booth with me on social media, just keep up with it a little bit. And so he did, and he didn't say anything during the course of the game. And I said, well, how'd the social media experiment go? He goes, well, I've learned that without a doubt that you are completely biased against both teams. I go, welcome to my world. That's exactly what it is. That's exactly what it is. So, but it does make a difference. And we're getting into that, right? About who the other quarterback is. Does that go into the model itself, who the opposing quarterback is when you decide to go for it on fourth down?
Yep. I mean, in the model that we feed you guys for Sunday Night Football, like the quarterback is one of the key variables, right? Because like that, it does. And it comes up in ways that you might not expect, right? Where sometimes you want to go for it more because the other team's quarterback is amazing and field position doesn't matter. Sometimes it's, you want to kick it because of the same reason, because, let's say, let's say it's to go up 10, for example, when you're up 7, like there might be a reason. I'm blanking on like why you would want to kick it, to be honest with you, but there are reasons why you want to kick it in the case of the other team's quarterback being amazing. There's also the confluence of your quarterback where, like, I always think it's interesting, to sort of like look at how defenses approach the game when they have, let's say, a Patrick Mahomes at quarterback versus when they have, maybe somebody a little bit more limited, let's say a Jalen Hurts at quarterback, where it's like you can be more aggressive because if you give up a score, Pat's got Pat's going to go ahead and have your back. And I think like when we talk about like the Chargers, for example, that's very much why I think that they're comfortable going for as many fourth downs as they are, because they have a great quarterback and they know that like he's going to cover a multitude of sins. If you're down by 7, like you're never out of the game with Justin Herbert. And whereas, one of the things, and again, this is where I get back to the point of like, when we're trying to argue these things on good faith, we look at the Saturday night game, right, where the New England Patriots are at the 7-yard line down by 13 with a little bit, like maybe half of a quarter left, and they kick a field goal to go down 10, right? Where they lose that game, right? And like the question becomes, and they lose that game, interestingly, because they never got within that one score again, right? Where, to me, the question is like, why is that decision made about Mac Jones? In that game, it's sort of like the quarterback to me mattered more in why you should go for it there, because Mac Jones was like barely crossing the 50-yard line all game. What's the likelihood if you go from being down 13 to down 10 and give up the opportunity you have to be inside the 10 again? What's the likelihood that Mac Jones is going to get you into scoring position 2 more times? Like that's the way that I sort of think about it from my own quarterback's perspective too.
Let's talk for just a minute about Chris Godwin. So I'm doing the Tampa game, and we've seen it a million times before. A guy catches the ball on a crossing route and comes up and chops out his knee, and now it's an ACL. So he's finished. A guy with 100 catches, Tom Brady goes off. I went off during the course of the broadcast because if there's ever a case, you played tight end in college, you understand this. There's no way to protect yourself. I don't care. You can talk about a quarterback, a punter, whatever you want to talk about. There is no worse position to be in than being a receiver with somebody flying at you from the back end, and they're going to take out your knees, right? So why do they do that? The defensive backs have been trained now. You can't go high. You can't hit them in the helmet. If you hit them in the neck, head or neck. So what's the surest way I'm going to go get them on the ground? And 100%, it is absolutely easier to make the tackle if you chop out their knees than if you hit them at the waist. No question about it. So the strategy of it, the legality of it, there's no question about it. But we are protecting everybody else on the football field except that player in that situation, and there's no way in hell he can protect himself. And that's just the way it is, and they've never changed it.
Yeah, and it's so hard. I know George Shahuri and I were sort of arguing about this in the office while the game was going on, because the other thing is, like, football is so hard. It's so hard to play defensive back that when we see like a helmet hit a knee, like we assume that the intent is that, when in reality, like you can't like lower a shoulder without also lowering your head. You know what I mean? In most cases. And so like if the play goes a little bit differently, then you're hitting the guy with your helmet on his knee. And like that is not great. I think the hard part is obviously we've legislated away the head injury stuff, which I think we have to do. If you legislate away the knee stuff, like there's no really place where a defensive back can cause an incompletion when the player's open. You know what I mean? So my solution, and I don't know like what you think of this, Chris, because it could have cascading effects, but you play wide receiver at the highest level. And to me, the issue is these receivers they're running too fast, right? Like if you made illegal contact legal again, or legal like it is in college, let's say, I think you eliminate a lot of these, right? Because the wide receivers aren't running those crossers as fast as they humanly can, right? And they're not wide open the way that in the way that you have to make that hit in order to cause an incompletion. To me, I think that's, and I know that it's hard to put the toothpaste back in the tube. 2004, that Marcus Pollard, when he was dragged to the turf every single game against Belichick, that's the one that they like sort of changed the rule on or emphasized it more. But if you did that, I think receivers, wouldn't be necessarily moving as fast. And that's really where you see all these head injuries and leg injuries, is where the receiver is sort of running these digs or crossers and they're not touched because they can't be touched, right? Where if you allowed a little bit more of contact downfield during the course of the route, you would cause these collisions would be less violent, I think, and you would end up with maybe a little bit fewer of these injuries.
Actually, I'm going to take the other side of that. I think a big reason why we're seeing more of those balls thrown is because you can't hit them in the head. As funny as that sounds, like at some point, like I had so many sets of stitches in my chin, it was ridiculous. I mean, like ridiculous. My chin still needs a plastic surgeon. But at some point, the quarterbacks start feeling sorry for you, right? If they're dragging you off the field and stitching you up too many times in a row, he's like, okay, I'm not going to throw that YOLO ball over the middle anymore. Now these guys are protected. They know they can't get hit in the helmet. So what are we getting? We're getting power forwards in the middle of the field going up and making catches against 5'11" and 6 foot defensive backs. It's a great strategy. It's absolutely a great strategy. So when I talk to defensive backs about trying to protect those guys, they all say the same thing. It's like, dude, you got 270-pound tight ends out here. How do you expect me to get them on the ground? You think I can tackle that guy if I go up high on him? I've got to go in here and chop his knees. And you think of Gronkowski and all the different shots that he's taken to his knees over the years, and you understand it. But I also have asked a lot of wide receivers, almost everyone I interview, and I say, okay, you get one protection, right? You can either have your head protected or you can have your knees protected. Which one do you want? 100% of them said, protect my knees. I have a good chance of surviving a blow to the head in any way, shape, or form. I'm not saying I always will, but you take out my knees and I'm going in for surgery and now I'm 1/10 of a second slower the next year, my career's over. Please protect my knees. And I understand all points of it. It's so brutal. It's like watching, it's just brutal to watch it happen during a game.
Yeah. And I think, especially at the professional level, I think this is obviously also, pertinent to the COVID discussion, I think after, 2 years now, like once you're a professional, especially now in the NFL, you know what the risks are with respect to concussions, right? Even like I played in, college back in like my last game was 2007. So still a long time ago. We watched the videos the first day of practice. They try to scare the heck out of you, neck injuries and head injuries and stuff. And, even like small ball Division II players, like they know the risk and they're willing to take it. That's how enticing football is. And, I think especially when you're a professional, again, like none of us want to see concussions happen. And I think that there should be a real discussion about what I'm talking about, which is, slowing the game down a little bit so these hits are not as jarring and things like that, for sure. But with respect to the risks and the reward, I think players are compensated fairly well, and they know the risks a priori, right? So I don't think it was that countercultural of you to be like, hey, look, like this is what players believe. Because I can see it, right, and I know, and football's everything to a lot of people, and it's not against the rules to express that and to understand that that's the case, and it's incumbent on the league to make the game such that players aren't like. Prevention is always easier than cleaning up the mess to begin with, right? Like, so try to find ways to prevent concussions that are different and knee injuries that are different than just throwing a flag once it already happens. You know what I mean? Because football is a violent game regardless. So try to make that violence a little bit more conducive to what your aims are, as opposed to just legislating it after it happens.
I really think that because most of these are blindside things, right? So it is a defensive back, and I'm going to narrow it down to a certain category. It's a 190-pound defensive back against a 260-pound tight end. That's the inherent unfairness if you try to legislate anything. And typically, if it's truly a blindside shot, anybody, even myself now, if Gronk were running sideways across the field and I went up and hit him waist high, he caught the ball, but he moved back towards his own goal line in any way, shape, or form, or I stopped any form of progress, could that be considered a tackle in the National Football League because of whatever? I mean, because the essence of what we're talking about, and I think the defensive backs have been put so unfairly at disadvantages in so many different ways. I mean, can you imagine trying to tackle one of these guys and last second moving your head out of the way so that your helmet doesn't catch some part? You're putting yourself in danger. I know because my son Austin played at Notre Dame, played safety. I'm like, damn it, he's going to get hurt trying to keep the other guy from getting hurt because he's putting his body in an odd position. It's hard. It really is. It's a hard thing to talk about because there's so many different elements to it.
Yeah, that's the thing is like, and I think that again, like trying to figure out why those hits happen, or like even like I know I sent you the video, the article about like what the league is trying to do with kickoffs, right? Like the league wanted to have fewer kickoffs, so they put the kickoff, the touchback to the 25, which like then now everybody in the league is just kicking it short and covering, right? Because they think that tackling a guy at the 23 is obviously preferable to the 25, but then of course like that defeats the purpose of the entire rule to begin with, which is to have fewer kickoffs, and so the league has to be. And I think they are to a certain extent. I mean, you think with the big data bowl and all this stuff, like they really have done a good job of researching the league. But I think we just need to be more creative about, okay, let's keep the spirit of football in place, but let's find ways where you're not putting players in these precarious positions. And I think, again, like, making it easier on defensive backs in some parts of the game, but harder in others, I think is more than a fair way. And again, like that's just my silly solution for that is again, just sort of having, just allowing the defensive backs to make smaller contact to like shoulders and stuff while the route is happening. And then I think the collisions will be less fierce, but I don't think they'll ever do that because I think that, so much of the passing game now is timing and stuff that it'll cause offenses to struggle for a year or two, which I don't know if they think is good for the product. Although offenses this week, it was the smallest number of touchdowns we've seen in a week in NFL in 27 years or whatever it was, I think this past week. So, nothing can get kind of worse than what we've seen over the last few days.
Yeah. Unintended consequences and, circle of life, all that kind of stuff. And the kickoffs, to me, one of the bigger things on the kickoffs is you have to give the receiving team a chance to commit a foul. There are so many fouls called in kickoff returns that you have to give them a chance to get backed up to their own 10-yard line because somebody held or somebody blocked in the back or somebody did something, which is exactly what happened in the game the other night. I was dying to talk about it, and we went right to commercial or something. and you can, it's unbelievable the number of things in a broadcast that you want to talk about. You got a promo or you got a graphic or and it's like, and you can't go back, once it's gone, it's gone. You can't do that. All right. Final topic. We've got to talk about COVID here a little bit. And give them some background as to why I bring this up to you, because you do have a background in this.
Yeah, my PhD is in mathematical biology. So like I studied population dynamics. I've published a few papers in epidemiology. So like I have some knowledge of how infectious diseases work. I think I have, like, to me, I think that the biggest thing when you get into this field, and I think most people now know that like these things are just uncertain, right? Like, and so if you know that kind of qualitatively how diseases work, and this particular one in general, you can see sort of the risks. And one of the producers of the show, Mike, back in was January 2020, asked me, he's like, "What is COVID going to be? Is COVID real?" And I go, make sure you fix yourself a desk at home. And because the thing about COVID was that made it tough was that the asymptomatic aspect of it was like I could have COVID, not know it. I could pass it to you, and you could have COVID without knowing it and then pass it to somebody else. And throughout that entire time, it's like pretty basically normal behavior by the two of us, and somebody else gets sick, sort of two degrees of separation from us. And that was always the thing about COVID that really scared me, was this latency period where, or not even latency period, but just asymptomatic period where you could have the disease, not know it, and never know it even, and pass it to a bunch of other people. And I think that's where the league is sort of treating those players as if they're not carriers of the disease anymore.
Yeah, and now the other scary part about this latest variant is that they're saying it's not quite as deadly, but it's much more contagious.
Yes.
And so now the argument is coming back like, well, what difference does it make then if I get vaccinated? Because the vaccine's not, doing anything with this variant. I mean, so I feel like my head is like going in a circle. Like I just want to turn on the television, have the smartest doctor that I can find, tell me what I should do, and then I don't want to think about it anymore. So your opinion, and it's obviously impacting the NFL right now, so much so that the NFL they're basically changing the rules. So if you're asymptomatic and you're vaccinated, they're basically not going to test you at this point, other than sort of random tests along the way. Okay, But I mean, is this an effort to get to the end of the season? Is this really what's in everybody's best interest? Because they are, 25 people are now testing positive and they can't play football games. So I don't know. I'm gonna back up and go, I have no idea. You at least have some background in this. What was your take on it?
Yeah, the Omicron variant is certainly that's the thing. It's uncertain. And this, to me, I think this is good as a topic to have with the fourth down stuff, because we've been like the scientific community has been wrong about this virus, right? Like at times. And it's important to realize that like the difference between science and just sort of trusting your gut is, as you talked about, 52-48, right? 60-40, right? And there are going to be times where we make missteps, but if you follow the science, you're going to be on that 60 side instead of the 40 side. And that's kind of where you want to be. And so a lot of this is subject to uncertainty, but I'll say this. So the latest CDC data, which was yesterday, basically cases per 100,000 people, there's 48 cases per 100,000 people for boosted people. So people who have the vaccine and the booster, 134 cases per 100,000 for vaccinated, and then 450 cases per 100,000 for unvaccinated. So even if you're just looking at vaccinated versus unvaccinated, it's 3 times as much as likely to have cases. And there are more people, by the way, who are vaccinated and unvaccinated. So you have kind of like also that issue where It's the base rate fallacy type of idea. So the NFL saying, okay, we're not going to care quite as much about vaccinated players. That's the backing there. That is basically saying a vaccinated player is way less likely to get COVID-19 and hence way less likely to pass it on. The issue becomes, obviously, if the case counts among the vaccinated grow, then you're still going to have people passing it. And it's not necessarily like no players have died of COVID. There are relatively few players. I think it was Dakota Dozier went to the hospital with it. Like there are some players who have had adverse reactions. There are some players who are rumored to have long COVID. The issue that I think the NFL is just hoping the next 6 weeks to a month to 2 months will not happen is the community effects, right? Whereas you look at every major city in the country right now, there are overloaded hospitals, which that means that cancer patients can't get in as fast as they want. And, that's really the second order stuff that I think the NFL is like, okay, we don't have that much of the season left. Let's make sure we get through this and let's hope. And then it's really just hope that these don't have community effects on people who are not on the team. To me, what I would have done is sort of instituted more strict outside of the building protocols, basically don't interact with other people. I understand that is not popular and probably not, So in my opinion, I think the league is going partial. They're partially, I think, data driven by what they're doing, but there are still obvious risks.
So you come out of the Thanksgiving season, right? And we see this huge spike that coincides with also the weather getting colder in the north. Yep. And people are back inside more anyway. Can't eat outside in the restaurants. You can't do all the things that we've been doing. So now we're here. Now we're going into the holiday season. And we're going to have people piled on top of people, including in my house. I'm going to have so many people here, and God bless everybody. And I love that I'm going to get a chance to see them. But there's no way that we're going to see less in the short term, right? I mean, it almost do the math. If people are gathering, you have to see more of that. Or am I completely wrong?
No, you do. I think, again, I think interactions among vaccinated and boosted people will likely not cause any problems. There will be some breakthroughs, of course, but if everybody's and if people are wearing masks and stuff, I do think that it'll be fine. It's more of like like everybody, and again, I'm not trying to cast aspersions on anybody's decision making, but like there's always somebody in a group who might not be vaccinated, right? And then that person could carry it. One of the studies that I did when I was in academia was, there were the measles, right? Measles was an eradicated disease in this country, and we have strict vaccine laws for going to school with measles, right? No one has measles in this country really. But overseas, there are not as strict of vaccine laws again, for measles. And so you would have something like Disneyland would have, and this was like 6 years ago, had somebody from the UK come over and bring measles and give it to a bunch of kids who were in unvaccinated communities. And they went from Disneyland and passed it to Utah, Salt Lake City, and like Seattle and around the country. And like, that's really the risk, right? Is like somebody is carrying it and there are vulnerable people. And then there's that dispersion that happens after because we're all traveling to see family. And, that's always the risk. And I think that the NFL explicitly in what they're doing right now is saying, okay, we're going to accept that risk for being able to play the rest of the regular season without much of a hiccup and deal with the consequences later. And I guess, to me, it is risky because, the tail risk here is that there are a bunch of symptomatic people, right, that end up coming from this, and it's worse than what we would have had, for example, in the Cleveland situation, where a lot of asymptomatic people had to sit out a game because of the previous protocols.
Is it possible this could be a good thing? In other words, we all heard about herd immunity and different things. If this variant really is not as deadly, and a lot of people in the country who do not want to take vaccines end up catching this, does that assist herd immunity?
It could. I think that the hard part is you rewind back to like June of 2020 when I thought the the thought process was you could only get COVID once. And so, much like the chicken pox, for example, and like, so if you get it once, then you're immune to it and, you don't have to worry about anything. And I think we've seen multiple people, Lamar Jackson being one, who've gotten COVID multiple times. And that obviously is a risk that hurts the herd immunity argument because, you can get it multiple times. That being said, like, there is a chance, and like this is just like, evolution and just general mutation, where it will probably, in all likelihood, get less deadly and infectious the more, we get into these variants, right? Because you think about the flu, right? Like the last pandemic we've had in this country was the 1919 Spanish flu, and that was extremely deadly, extremely infectious. And now the flu in this country is basically endemic, and we just deal with it. People die of it for sure, but we just deal with it. And the interesting thing is not that many people take the flu shot relative to what we like, right? But the less infectious, the less deadly a disease is, the more that you can accept people taking the vaccine less. So like the flu vaccine is only, it's nowhere close as effective as the COVID vaccine. And it's nowhere near as taken, right? Like we have, 70% of adults taking the COVID vaccine. That's not enough because of how infectious and deadly it is. But if you decrease the infectiousness and deadliness of COVID over time, then the number of us that are vaccinated for it will be enough. And just like it is for every endemic disease like the flu or even something like chickenpox.
Fill me up. So far this year, I have had 3 COVID shots. I have had 2 shingle shots and 1 flu shot. Honestly, if they told me I needed to take 47 vaccinations this year, I would walk in there and just go ahead. Right. Now, that doesn't make me smart. That doesn't make me anything. Matter of fact, sometimes I go, that's just honestly too trusting of anybody. But it's kind of the way I feel about it. But there are so many people who feel just as strongly on the opposite side of it. And I mean, we're going through this in the NFL, the fake vaccination cards. And it's just like, who would have ever dreamt of all the different things that we'll be talking about over the last 2 years of the NFL season?
Well, it's interesting because like one of the last years where I was a professor was the Ebola epidemic or pandemic, depending upon how far it got. And every single day in class, I would talk about it and talk about infectious diseases and how calculus could help you sort of understand it. And there were 2 deaths in America with Ebola, right? Like it is very much like very, very similar to what we deal with in football, where there are risks, there are rewards, there are tail risks, which is what if stuff really goes wrong? And, we're in a once in a century sort of event here. And it's interesting to sort of talk about that. But I think what you're saying is extremely important to talk about when you defer to experts on stuff, right? Like there is an increase in sort of the credibility of experts, and other people defer to you on football, which I think is a perfectly reasonable as well, because you've earned that right. And I think that's maybe what's broken down a little bit, right? Is people spend their entire lives going to school to study this, and it's just not being listened to, or people. And I think that's, for example, to bring it back to football, I think when coaches look at somebody like me and say, you're just not respecting the game with respect to like 4th down decisions and stuff, that's what they're doing, right? They've coached the game their entire lives. They played it. And some nerd over here with a bow tie is coming over and saying, well, you're doing it wrong. Right. And so some humility is I think required for this entire discussion, which is there are experts and there are risks and rewards, and there are outcomes that don't always correlate with what the right decision is sometimes. And we just have to be, over time, we have to trust that we're all working in good faith. And I think in football, I think we're closer to that than in real life, which, it's whatever. But they're all sort of tied together.
Yeah. So the 60-40, sometimes you're on the 40% side and you still should make the same bet because there's still the 60% side, or at least that's the way I look at it. So Eric, you're brilliant. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. And thanks for doing it again.
Of course. Thanks, Chris. Thanks for having me on.